don't think it would be an exaggeration to say JRPGs haven't been in as good a position as they are right now in a very long time. From the Final Fantasy and Breath of Fire games on the SNES to the Final Fantasy and Breath of Fire games on the PS2 that we don't talk about, the genre had a very strong run. Then 7th generation happened and the whole genre hit a massive lull. Maybe it was because publishers were putting more focus on super flashy, in-your-face action games with the most cutting-edge graphics of the time, which took away from slower, more methodical genres that didn't have as massive of mainstream appeal. So JRPGs were pushed towards handhelds and didn't get many notable releases during these years outside of maybe Lost Odyssey. Even Final Fantasy seemed to move away from the genre by doing whatever the heck 13 was supposed to be. It wasn't all bad, we did get titles like Resonance of Fate, but overall the generation didn't have many titles that really scratched that itch, which unfortunately carried on for basically till now. It seems like the genre is slowly but surely picking itself back up though. It is picking itself up very slowly, but it's still doing it. In an age of RPG Maker, game engines, throwback games, and Kickstarter, we've gotten everything from indie darlings like Undertale and Crosscode to more notable new series from companies like Square Enix in the form of Octopath Traveler. There are even spiritual successors to Shadow Hearts and Wild Arms, Penny Blood and Art Fantasia respectively, which I'm really looking forward to. Maybe after the success of such games, publishers will finally realize the old thing that's always had an audience still has an audience, and as a result, we're finally seeing bigger JRPGs. Nowhere near the amount of entries on the PlayStation 1 and 2, but you know, it's getting better. Atlus has been giving us titles like Soul Hackers 2, Shin Megami Tensei 5, and that game. Sega turned Yakuza into one with Like a Dragon. Even Square themselves are cranking titles out, thanks to the success of Bravely Default, I'd imagine. Thanks to smaller studios and reasonable budgets, they've not only been putting out collections and remakes of older games like the Mana series and Live Alive, how do you pronounce that? But also new games in the same spirit as classics. Octopath Traveler has garnered enough success to get a sequel, Dragon Quest and Saga have received new entries to critical acclaim, and they've even revived the spirit of Final Fantasy Tactics and Triangle Strategy. Yet my favorite project in this little throwback wave, by far, is Voice of Card. The pitch is simple, a series of straightforward short story JRPGs where everything is presented via cards. Oh, and also the creative director is Yoko Taro, you know, our Lord and Savior, hallowed be his name. I've been keeping an eye on this series since it was first shown, and now that we have 3 whole entries, I figured it would be fun to talk about all of them, because I really just have to make things hard on myself. I really enjoy talking about the old and obscure. These games feel like they fit that same kind of niche I like so much. Plus, what's the point in focusing on older titles and never shining a light on new games that seem like they fit the same audience? Before we begin, let's just make some things clear. I will not be discussing all games simultaneously. Each entry gets its own segment. This is partially to save time. That lot of good that did. But also because I'm going to be playing these games in sequence as I write this script. The only one I've played prior to this is the Isle Dragon Roar, and I want to see if and how the series might have improved in its first year. I'm also going to be saving time by doing my best not to constantly repeat myself any more than I usually do. These 3 games are very similar to each other in a lot of ways, with the same general structure, presentation style, combat system, and so on. I'd imagine it's to save development time and money and to make this more of a platform to tell these short stories. But hey, I'd much rather they do that than waste millions making a new engine to render individual hair strands. Because of this, I'm going to cover my thoughts on the overall Voice of Cards system, let's call it, in my section on Isle Dragon Roars, and I'll bring up differences with the other games if they're significant enough to mention. Otherwise, just assume everything I bring up in the first segment applies to the other 2. Last but not least, I won't be going super deep into spoilers here. These are still relatively new games and short ones at that. I think that's just about everything, so let's turn over the first card and see what it has to say. I feel like there's always something to be said about simply fulfilling a promise. The announcement trailer for Isle Dragon Roar showed a very simple game where you take on the role of a questionable hero and travel the land in pursuit of a dragon. No fancy gimmicks, no extraneous mechanics, just an old school experience with interesting presentation. Lo and behold, that's exactly what we got on October 28th, 2021. Okay, well, I guess you could call the cards a gimmick, but it was enough to catch my attention. Let's discuss that first, since it's one of the main things that makes this system work and be so much fun. I absolutely love the presentation in these games. As a lifelong fan of trading card and board games, having an entire game presented in this style appeals to me quite a bit. Everything in this game is cards. The characters are cards, the enemies are cards, the items are cards, the world is cards, even the cards are cards. Each one is decorated with gorgeous hand-drawn art designed by Kimihiko Fujisaka and his team, known for their work on Drakengard and The Last Story. The colors are calm and seem almost muted, with very few bright colors in favor of more neutral tones. You know, lots of blacks, browns, greens, white, and other natural shades that remind me of fantasy manga covers I would find in the bookstore. If you've ever seen the manga series Witch Hat Atelier, which is something I'd recommend if you're interested in world-building centric fantasies, it gives off a similar feel. A more down-to-earth kind of fantasy. Occasionally there are some nice eye-catching splashes of color like the main character's blue and gold accents, but they're used very sparingly. It almost feels like you commissioned someone to redraw a tabletop RPG book to make it look a little brighter and not bogged down with absurd amounts of detail. Personally, I really like this. They could have gone the Octopath Traveler route and just used that HD 2D style like the rest of Square's releases in this little wave, but that would just make it blend in with the rest of said games. It'd also probably save them on budget, since I imagine it would take a lot more time and money to develop all the sprites and backgrounds and pixel art. Having everything depicted with just a single still image is probably a lot cheaper, although I can't imagine why people might find this choice unappealing. They do make up for the lack of character animation through card animation and cutscenes or battles where the characters are just, you know, hanging around on cards, as you do. The cards themselves will move and shift to depict actions. They'll bounce around when people are arguing, turn to the side when a character is hurt, and even become tattered to show exhaustion. It's not the same as, say, a visual novel switching sprites to convey emotion, but I find it works well enough. What really sells the presentation is the narrator. This is Voice of Cards after all, and what would the cards be without the voice? His greeting is the first thing you hear when starting a new game, claiming he is the game master and hopes you enjoy the story you're about to experience. This lone voice is Todd Haberkorn? I'm not entirely sure. And his reading of all the text and dialogue in this warm, calm, slightly sarcastic tone really suits the spirit of the game. You might recognize him from several major roles in English dubs of some anime. He played Hikaru in Ouran High School Host Club, Death of the Kid in Soul Eater, Ling Yao in Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, Haruka Nanase in Free, and he even voiced Kimihiro Watanuki, the protagonist of Holic, one of my personal favorites. That was fun to find out. The man has a lot of experience under his belt, but I think this is the first time I've heard him use a deeper, more chill kind of inflection, and it works. Todd's voice combined with the visuals gives the whole experience a very charming feel. Now, what is the story? Well, in the fantasy kingdom of... I don't think they ever gave it a name, actually. There's a fierce dragon on the loose. So, Queen Nilla sends out a help-wanted ad to every adventurer in the kingdom to go kill it for a massive reward. This is where you, the protagonist, arrive. The narrator explains he, and you by extension, are a traveling warrior accompanied by a strange creature named Mar. The protagonist's name by default is Ash, but I'll call him Klain. On your way out of town, you meet a monster-hating witch named Melanie. You decide to join together with her to slay the dragon. There's also a highly regarded organization called the Ivory Order who are after the dragon, and of course, they disregard your group entirely. Once all of that is established, you set off into the world, traveling from town to town in order to overcome each obstacle in your path to riches. If you're thinking, that can't be all to the story, you'd be right, but not as right as you think. I feel like attaching Yoko Taro's name to this project does more harm than good in terms of the story. See, Yoko Taro has a very well-deserved reputation as a total weirdo who writes bizarre stories that subvert expectations of even the other stories he's written. This is a guy who took a joke ending from a fantasy game and turned it into a post-apocalyptic sci-fi action RPG about philosophies on human existence and its relation to technology. So if you go into this game expecting something on a similar level to Nier or Nier Automata, you're gonna be disappointed, mainly because he didn't write the story. That was Yuki Matsuo, whose only credit before this is as a lead scenario writer on Nier Reincarnation. Taro was the creative director of Voice of Cards, so while the project in general was meant to show his vision, he wasn't directly involved with writing the story. I'm saying this because if you have any guesses to how the story turns out, just based on the premise, you're probably correct. It does have twists, and it is trying to subvert expectations, but if you have even a small passing familiarity with fantasy fiction made in the past couple decades, you are not going to find a lot of surprises here. Which is why I think some might find its narrative underwhelming if you go in knowing Yoko Taro as that guy who directed a game about a sexy blindfolded robot lady with big swords. Is there more to the dragon than we know at the outset? Is there some secret about the main character relevant to the story? Is the Ivory Order not as innocent and benevolent as they'd like to let on? Yes, yes, and yes, but I don't think that makes it a bad story. I think it's a story in the same vein as something like Dragon Quest. Specifically Dragon Quest XI. That game's story is the most vanilla JRPG story I can think of to be released in recent memory. It doesn't even make an attempt at a twist. It's as straightforward as the Dragon Quest games released over 20 years ago. Yet the game received massive critical acclaim from most reviewers in part due to it being so traditional. And that's exactly the kind of story the developers wanted for this game. Yoko Taro even stated in an interview how he wanted the story to capture the same feel as those old Dragon Quest titles. I feel Yuki Matsuo did a very good job in following the spirit of those retro stories, since most of the appeal comes from the characters and world rather than the plot itself. The main cast and NPCs you meet along the way are quite charismatic and well-rounded. I found a lot of the interactions between everyone quite funny. Along with Melanie, you're joined by Ridis, a debt-ridden elf girl who relies on what's basically a fantasy teen mag for guidance, as well as Bruno, a total meathead who only wants to beat stuff up and flex. He's awesome. He's just great.
His victory sealed, Bruno strikes a glorious pose and shouts out, "Witness the power of power."
Their stories are definitely meant to be sillier than the main trios, especially Bruno, seeing as his only motivation is going on an adventure rather than study like his father wants and is just happy to tag along. Ridis is a bit more concerning. Her mother has been scammed repeatedly and they're in massive amounts of debt as a result, so she wants the reward to abolish their debt and get the landlord off their back. There are plenty of NPCs with goofy things to say, like how every innkeeper has a different excuse to let you stay for free. That was a pretty good running gag. You can learn some very interesting tidbits of each character and monster you encounter. In the pause menu, there's a collection where you can read little descriptions for everyone, but you unlock special secret flip sides under certain conditions, like speaking to them enough times. For example, see this sweet old lady? Turns out she might have murdered her husband and is eating his corpse. This little village boy, he peeps on his older sister. This cute elf girl, she's a stalker. I won't spoil any more of these, but that should give you an idea of where the emphasis lies in this game's story. It's not meant to present all these philosophical ideas and toy with the concept of one's relation with an interactive medium. It's a fun little story that's used as a basis to push you through this charming world, which is exactly what Yoko Taro wanted for the experience. Just like the story, the gameplay is fittingly simple. As I mentioned earlier, your main task is to explore the world, going from town to town and solving whatever issues need to be resolved to reach the next destination. Since the game is meant to feel analog like a tabletop game, the world is covered in face-down cards that flipped over as you discover new areas, and all the cards are swept away when you enter a new location. It's really cute and supports the idea that we're all just hanging out at the GM's house for tabletop night. One convenient aspect of the presentation is how you can freely travel across the board in a single move so long as you're going to an uncovered card. It's like having accurate fast travel from the start. Really nice for revisiting areas and finding secrets like the 10 mysterious cards, or saving time in overworld travel. Of course, while you're exploring, you'll get into plenty of battles. These battles are incredibly complex and loaded with all sorts of creative mechanics for an absurd amount of strategies. Nah, I'm just kidding. The combat is just as straightforward as the rest of the game. It's a good old turn-based affair where everyone gets to pick something to do, you pick that something, something happens, and then the next person goes. You get 3 party members that can each have 4 skills active at once, and you hit things until they die. It's about as basic as you can get for a JRPG battle system. And I love it. Or at least enjoy it to a great degree. When a battle starts, the GM pulls out a special board for combat, which is insanely cute, showing some candles and a little box that contains pink gems. These gems are how you use most of your skills. You get one whenever a party member takes a turn with a limit of 10. So it's meant to act as a sort of shared mana system that resets every battle. I like this because it's a very fitting way to trim down on the battle system, not giving your characters individual MP for skills. In fact, each character only has 4 stats, and 3 of them are always visible on their cards during combat: attack, defense, and HP. The only one not shown is speed, which I'm pretty sure determines the turn order. All of these stats are very small, with none of them reaching the absurd digits that may be found in other JRPGs. Not only is this great for reinforcing the analog atmosphere, with the stats being printed on cards like in Magic the Gathering or other card games, it also helps determine how an attack is likely to go. Attack minus defense roughly equals damage. It's never exact and more like a general range though. It lets you see how an attack will play out so you can plan accordingly. Another element that makes sense in context is how many of the skills require a die roll, usually for determining bonus damage or adding to your base attack. It's a common aspect in tabletop RPGs, and fortunately they don't make you roll a die to see if you hit at all. Seriously, that's just super annoying. You have other familiar elements like elemental weaknesses and resistances, which I've stated before isn't great for combat strategy if overdone, but Isle Dragon Roars reins it in enough to not make it railroad your strategy so much, mainly because there isn't a ton of strategy. If there's one critique I found in basically every review that I kind of agree with, it's how this game is ridiculously easy. Now, difficulty in games is something that's become a massive headache to discuss ever since that one game came out and made a bunch of people incredibly smug, and it's a topic that applies to RPGs a bit differently. If an action game is difficult, well, you can just practice, get down the combos, learn enemy patterns. In RPGs, especially JRPGs, difficulty is typically just a numbers game. If you're having trouble in a certain area, the common solution is to simply grind for however long until you raise your stats high enough to proceed. I have never found this to be a positive aspect, but I'm not sure there are many ways to make this kind of game more challenging without just raising the stats of enemies. Then again, once you do, the solution is just grinding, which just adds tedium instead of challenge. Especially in this game, where the combat is simple and straightforward on purpose to the point it doesn't even have much in the way of party customization. Everyone has 4 skills in combat, they unlock them in a set order, and you can switch them out however you'd like when you have 5 or more. It's nice, but I can see it feeling limiting to a lot of players. I hear the following games in this series improve upon this aspect, but we'll see when we get there. Personally, I don't think the lack of difficulty is that big a deal. It allows you to move throughout the world at a better pace when you don't have to stop and raise your levels, and it might just be me, but there's something I find inherently satisfying about the combat system. That might be due to the sound design, which is at its peak in battle. They managed to give each attack a different animation and sound, which makes them all feel distinct, as well as sounding very chunky. All the whooshes and smacks and sizzle and zaps, along with the ways the card responds to each of them, give your attack a good sense of weight, especially when you land a critical hit. There's this cool flash around your card before they dish out more pain. That's really satisfying to see. Late in the game, your party unlocks these expensive super attacks, like Melanie's Zero Element spell, and casting them just feels really good. Plus, I love the little bumps and clacks of your marker in the overworld, or the rolling of dice. It's really nice. Another immersive aspect is how there's no actual battle theme outside of boss fights. The songs from Overworld continue as you fight. The music was composed by Keiichi Okabe and his company Monaco, Monaka? I don't know. The guy who also worked on Drakengard, Nier Automata, some Tekken games, Ridge Racer, and the Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers expansion. If you're familiar with his work in those games, it carries over here. Moody piano and orchestral pieces I cannot properly explain because, as I've stated before, I'm not that big on music. It does sound very nice though. I like to imagine the soundtrack is just playing on the GM's laptop out of view. If there's one complaint I have about the sound of this game, it's... Okay, you'll have to stay with me on this because it's going to sound really petty. The gems dropping into the box in battle sound plasticky. I told you this would be petty, After hearing it dozens if not hundreds of times during my playthrough, it started sounding a little cheap, like the GM picked up a little tube of randomly shaped plastic rocks for $2 the last time he was at the game store. Maybe that's why we have a limit of 10 gems, that's all was in the tube. The gems give off a clunk when I think a heavier clunk or a lighter clink would have made it a bit better. Make them sound like glass or actual gemstones and it would sound a lot better. That's really the only critique I can think of. The presentation as a whole is fantastic for what is considered a low budget project. Overall, Isle Dragon Roar sets up a solid basis for the Voice of Cards series. A short story and a charming world coupled with unique presentation and streamlined gameplay that does a great job of capturing the feel of old school favorites. Now, just like how hearing the end of those old games likely wouldn't surprise anyone today, I'm going to tell you how Isle Dragon Roar ends. If you'd like to avoid that, skip to the time on screen now. So, if you guessed the dragon is actually a falsely persecuted victim of the Ivory Order's corruption, you're absolutely correct. Have a cookie. You pursue the dragon to a place called the Isle of Blight. Ooh, spooky. Where it turns out the main character actually lived as a child in a village full of people used as test subjects for Ivory Order medicine. Throughout the game, we're shown how dependent people are on this cure, but now we see the terrible means by which it is created, including how some experience severe side effects from consuming it, such as Mar. The large beefy creature traveling with you this whole time is actually your twin sister who was transformed by the Ivory Order's tests as a child, during which your parents were also killed, and experienced so traumatic you blocked it from your memory only for it to suddenly resurface. Now you're determined to track the dragon down, find a way to cure your sister, and, get money. Once you reach the dragon at the top of the volcano, he explains he's been trapped by the Order for years, tortured every day to produce the medicine's key ingredient, Dragon Tear. Only the higher-up members of the Order know why they need the dragon, to the point where even the Queen is completely unaware of its true role in the kingdom. Tired of being on the run and knowing the Order will recapture him eventually, he asks you to kill him. Before you can, the Ivory group arrives, consisting of Winifred, Berwin, Hedwin, and the powerful Sherwin. I guess having Win in your name is a necessary qualification for joining the Order. They've been on a journey to capture the dragon and resume its torture. But Sherwin kills it, and the dragon's body falls into the volcano. Now, wanting to know why Sherwin did such a thing, you track him down to the mausoleum, where he then explains himself. When he was young, his parents fell victim to the effects of Ivory Order medicine. Sherwin worked hard to rise through the ranks in order to stop its production. Once he found out the dragon was the source of its main ingredient, he swore to kill it and destroy the Order from within. Wait a second here. A corrupt and highly influential organization knowingly releasing a harmful product to the people and engaging in inhumane practices? Okay, now I know I'm playing a fantasy. That would never happen in real life. Now, determined to rid the world of Dragon Tear and exact his revenge, he consumes the last vial and becomes
the Owisiswin.
Okay, now you're taking the piss game. What even is that? I love how this boss fight is presented with his body shown through a larger collage of cards to represent his scale. It's a great fight with both of his wins enemies with different abilities, but both have the power to heal and revive each other. After two hefty phases where the Order Trio end up helping you out, it suddenly overpowers your party and attempts to cast a world-ending power. Melanie risked her life in order to cast a forbidden spell, which leaves the monster vulnerable just long enough for you to end the battle. Once all the dust settles, you're left with one small drop of Dragon Tear remaining, and three choices with what to use it for. You can stop Melanie from becoming a monster as a result of the forbidden magic, turn your sister back to normal, or revive the dragon. I'm not huge on this, pretty much picking your own ending, but, it means you don't have to replay the whole thing to make specific choices, so it's fine. However, if you manage to collect all 10 mystery cards that are scattered throughout the world, which really isn't difficult at all, you get all 3. So that's cool. Queen Nilla learns of the dragon's true nature and places restrictions on how medicine is created in order to give the dragon a comfortable life in exchange for producing Dragon Tear. Not really sure how he's gonna do that, maybe he'll just watch Grave of the Fireflies on repeat. The Ivory Order is disbanded and the Wind Trio form a new charity organization. Ridis didn't receive enough of the reward for her to get out of debt. Bruno is still Bruno, and the hero lives his days traveling with Melanie and his now restored sister. Pretty satisfying conclusion. Just like I said at the beginning of this section, there's always something to be said about fulfilling a promise. The pitch for Isle Dragon Roars is a first step into a series intentionally being as uncomplicated as you can get with a modern JRPG and doing it well. As someone who enjoys that style of game, I had a great time playing it, and it made me interested in picking up the sequel. I can understand some of the criticisms, like the low difficulty and over-reliance on its quirky visuals, so while I can try defending those aspects of the game, I will admit they can be factors in why someone maybe wouldn't be interested in trying it. I still think it's a very charming game that fits a specific niche, and I'm always for games aiming for a smaller audience. Now, let's flip over to the second card and see if they manage to do it even better. The Forsaken Maiden is a game about the bleakness of mortality and the inescapable fate of death. I think. Released on February 17th, 2022, the development time for this game was just 4 months. Normally that would be cause for alarm and an end product with the quality of a very lackluster midnight run to McDonald's, but the development team were able to create a sequel this soon due to the mechanical base of the first game. Like I said earlier, the general voice of cards system is used more as a basis to tell these short stories without needing to invest in a ton of new assets for each entry. Yosuke Saito also credits the quick turnaround to the eagerness of Alim's staff in creating a follow-up that implements all the feedback they received from Isle Dragon Roars. Did they accomplish this? I'd say they did. In some places. Starting off with the story, it's much more involved than the first game. The narrator states this tale takes place on a collection of islands that values tradition and culture, which immediately made me think of that scene in Fiddler on the Roof. You take on the role of an adventurous young man who kind of looks like this world's equivalent of someone who hangs out at Hot Topic too much. I mean, look at him. Baggy shirt, tight pants, tall boots, droopy eyes, black everywhere, that weird neck choker ribbon thing. He looks like the embodiment of an AFI album if it got into D&D. If that wasn't enough, his default name is Baron. And I immediately changed it to Felt. Anyway, he finds a young mute girl with a very puffy fluffy coat in the nearby cave where he's keeping his ramshackled boat and goes to the village for some monster hunting work. Apparently, everyone in this village has been listening to Mount Erie's A Crow Looked at Me because they speak like something terrible is about to happen and they're ready to die. Turns out something terrible is about to happen and they're ready to die. In this world, the different islands are protected by guardian spirits that require a new maiden every so often to keep them safe. This one, known as the Omega Isle, does not have a proper maiden, and as a result the island will be destroyed because destiny. Like, that's actually the reason they're giving for why they aren't trying to escape. Like, nah, too late, you know, there's no maiden, we just have to die. The whole village is fine, just rolling over and accepting their fate, with the hero being the only one apparently willing to find a solution. Luckily, he manages to find a strange living hand puppet named Lack, who informs him the mute girl he found is actually the maiden of Omega Isle. Her name is Laddie, and for reasons you find out later in the game, she was unable to fulfill her task, but she's willing to take on the role if given a way. Turns out there is a way. You just need to collect the sacred relics of the 4 maidens of the neighboring isles. So, you know, that's pretty fortunate. The structure of the plot is still linear, but in contrast to Isle Dragon Roars, where you have a main story thread and a bunch of stops from start to end, Forsaken Maiden plays more like a collection of vignettes centering on the different maidens. Each isle you visit has a respective maiden and attendant, with each functioning as a mini arc that helps show their stance on the destined task. See, the maidens are actually fine loaning you their sacred relics integral to the security of their homeland, but you have to do something for them first. Over the course of the game, each one displays a different personality and approach to the knowledge. They have a sacred mission in a way that reflects their unique circumstances. If you think the task of slaying a dragon in the first game was too generic, having yet another rehash of Final Fantasy I's collect the 4 sacred items in some way related to the elements might sound even worse, but I think the story is actually a step up from Isle Dragon. Yuki Matsuo didn't return as the lead writer. Instead, we have Yuki Wada, who helped with the previous game's story and also doesn't have many credits outside this series. The tone is a bit more, how do I put this? Anime. The kind of anime that was adapted from a competently written light novel that isn't an isekai and still managed to get enough popularity for a 2-core season that goes largely unnoticed among bigger names but is still worth your time. So, Chivalry of a Failed Knight, basically. It's more serious, but in a melodramatic way that reminds me of the best parts of Kingdom Hearts. talking about healing Laddie's heart from prior trauma so she can save everyone. And no, that isn't a metaphor. There are actually several segments in the game where you have to visit a realm of her emotions called the Heart's Domain and travel to locations like Anxiety Town and Burdenberg to find heart scars and work through her trauma with the power of sharpened metal and friendship. It has as much cheese as a pizza, and yet I still found it to be more compelling and darker than the first game. Each aisle gives us a look into the different cultures of the world, distinct and disconnected from one another, and the different ways they treat a similar custom. There are clearly themes here of life, death, the concept of fate, and how one may choose to approach those subjects. The Azure Maiden is full of cheer and wants to spend her life to the fullest, steadfast in doing what needs to be done for her position. Meanwhile, the Crimson Maiden is berated for not living up to the standards of their mother and aims to prove themselves in combat. I'd say the Ivory and Onyx Maidens have the best segments, to the point I really don't want to give you their setups and risk spoiling what happens. It's really cool. By meeting all 4 maidens and helping them with their individual tasks, it also helps structure Laddie's arc in becoming a full-fledged maiden, learning from others as she attempts to take on the responsibility of her own homeland. Overall, it's a much more satisfying experience than the first game's plot, and there were even a few twists here and there I did not see coming, so props to that. However, it does lose points for not having Bruno. The tone of the presentation has also changed, with one of the biggest alterations being how the narrator is now Mike Atherley rather than Todd Haberkorn. I don't know how to pronounce that. He's probably most well known for voicing Polnareff in the Stardust Crusaders OVA series from the 90s, Shuji in She, the Ultimate Weapon, and someone in Echo Knight Beyond. IMDb doesn't say which character he played. He does an okay job. His voice is a bit brighter than Todd's, but I think the lower, more somber tone from the first game would have suited this game's plot better. Not to say Mike does a bad job, it's just odd to hear a more chipper voice read out this darker, if cheesier story. The music has also been changed up, namely by the influence of Latin, of all things. Acoustic guitars, tango melodies, and samba. It gives a very different feel to the first game, which was primarily Celtic inspired. Listening to both soundtracks, I prefer Maiden's for its unique atmosphere and ability to build mood better from how different all the tracks are. So all in all, the presentation is okay. It's largely unchanged, but it's different enough to matter. I don't think it's drastically better or worse as a whole than IDR, but it still has that lovely at-home tabletop atmosphere, just with a slightly different flavor. Now, how about that combat? Is it more complex? Did they up the difficulty? Is it better than the first game? My answers are, sort of, in places, and depending on your personal preference. One aspect of its story structure has you and Laddie team up with an Isles Maiden pair for your visit, which means you only have 2 party members capped for the whole game, while the guest members have locked stats and abilities. To make up for this, you and Laddie gain way more skills than the characters in the first game, and unlock them at a much faster rate. Of course, the lanky dude main character with 3 weapons is geared towards being the damage dealer, and the cute, mute, passive girl mostly has supportive skills, because, you know, not much you can do about that, I guess. Then each guest pair has a different lineup of skills that are just generally useful, so you have more control over how your characters perform in battle since you need to tailor your skills around maidens. The skills are a bit more interesting this time, such as the power charge allowing you to roll a die and generate gems equal to your roll. That was cool. Speaking of which, each character can now generate gems. One of the first changes I noticed to the combat is how the pass command from the first game has been changed to charge, which is a very nice improvement. Previously, if a character was unable to contribute in battle, they just had to pass and waste their turn. Now, not only are they getting a gem by default, they're giving a second one as a boost. This is a great addition to combat because it means, at the very least, no party member is ever completely useless. If they can't deal much damage or don't have enough gems for a good attack, they can make another gem for free, and that's better than just passing, because it means the next person can then make a more powerful attack, hopefully progress the game stage. Another altered aspect is how you can now have 5 skills active at once instead of 4. This is likely due to the aforementioned lack of staple characters. Letting you get an extra skill slot is pretty reasonable, gives you more room for choice, not much else to say. You're likely to use this new fancy 5th slot for a character's link skill. See, since each party member is joined with another, they get a unique super move stronger than anything they can do by themselves. They're also a lot more expensive to use than other skills, costing about 5 or 6 gems per use, but you do get your money's worth. Gems worth? These skills are powerful and flashy, usually coming with some party-wide benefit or enemy debuff. If the rest of combat was structured like IDR, these wouldn't be very useful. But by giving you 5 skills per character and changing past to charge, along with having 4 members active in your party at once, they make for a fun inclusion that aren't very tricky to include in your arsenal. Heck, there are even equipment and abilities that give you extra gems at the start of combat. It's just a shame how the gems have the same sound. Like, they didn't change it at all. It bothers me a lot more than it realistically should. So they definitely added to the combat and gave you more to think about, but does that make it more difficult? For a good chunk of the game, I was thinking they actually made it easier than IDR. Early enemies were nothing more than minor inconveniences, and I gained skills so quickly it seemed like overkill. Then, ever so slowly, followed by not very slowly at all, the game does ramp up the challenge towards the end. Sadly, it's a challenge by the usual method of JRPGs, that being the enemy having higher numbers than your numbers at a given point. I get why developers do this, and I probably don't have a right to complain about this since this genre is most of what I play even in my free time, but it does come across as rather uninteresting when it just boils down to having higher stats rather than requiring deeper tactics. Now, for what it's worth, I never felt the game was being cheap. Most boss fights I could handle perfectly fine when I encountered them, and the biggest hurdle to getting higher numbers was just the fact that equipment was so much more expensive and leveling up takes forever by the mid-20s, so the developers did an alright job keeping it balanced while still testing me more than Isle Dragon, so we'll give them that. Overall, the increased late game hurdles and improved capabilities make the combat more engaging, but it still has the issue of having too many encounters, which, you know, IR kind of had towards the late game, but it didn't get this bad. One of the worst things you can do for JRPG combat is to have too much, because a lot of the time it is purely functional, and while it can be enjoyable and cathartic, having too much of anything is inevitably going to get really boring. And an unreasonably high encounter rate is something that even bugs me in games that have it. Isle Dragon was fine because it was only about 12 to 13 hours, and I never felt it was packing too many fights, but Forsaken Maiden is nearly 6 hours longer, and man, does it feel like it sometimes with how long it takes to get through dungeons. There were moments where I'd get in another fight less than 5 steps from my last, and that's a joke people make about random encounters in JRPGs. This isn't helped by the pace of fights being the same as Isle Dragon, where animations can rattle on for a bit too long and take up more time than needed. So even without grinding, it can feel like it's just filling time. I still enjoy the combat and appreciate the changes they made, but I'd be lying if I said it doesn't have some fat to trim, and while the uptick in difficulty is appreciated towards the end, the final gauntlet of the game was just trying my patience. This is kind of weird. I thought the script would be longer, and I already made it to the spoiler section, so, yeah. If you don't want to know what happens at the end of the game, which is something I'd recommend because the story is hugely satisfying, skip to the time on screen now. Otherwise, let's get to the ending. Once you've gathered the 4 other Maiden's relics and learn about Laddie's past, like how her mother died and the village began acting cruelly towards her because her lackluster training efforts that followed, you return to your homeland to battle against Shadow Laddie. Persona 5 reference. Or probably Persona 4 reference, that would probably be better. However, you're unable to finish the battle at the moment and return to the real world, where you battled the sea serpent that's come to ruin the island. While the villagers still seem unwilling to battle for their lives, you and Laddie head out to confront the monster with the help of the Crimson Maiden, Livia. Once it's shown to be a challenge, the villagers start firing cannons while cheering for Laddie. After the battle, it's revealed the villagers had only been pretending to hate Laddie for all these years after her mother performed the Maiden's ritual because... oh yeah, I never explained what that is. So the Maiden's Ritual is a ceremony where a destined young girl sacrifices herself to the island's spirit to gain its protection until the next Maiden comes along. They didn't want Laddie to do that, so they acted terribly to her when she was a child to make her not want to partake in the ritual, which seems like a really awful course of action to use on an 8-year-old who just lost their mother, but I guess it's the thought they were willing to let the whole island die, and probably Laddie along with it, that counts? I guess that's dumb. That's stupid. She's also able to speak now because she originally lost her voice screaming in anguish at how unloved and abandoned she felt due to the villagers' treatment of her, but all forgiven now? Laddie, please go see a therapist. I'm worried about you. No time though, because you have to go kill Shadow Laddie to completely heal her heart before she and the main character confess their love to each other. It's cute, if very predictable, but far from the most forced JRPG romance I've seen. This happy moment is short-lived, however, when Lack shows up and reveals they're actually the villain by kidnapping Laddie, forcing you to pursue them further into the heart's domain. What follows is a very, very dragged-out dungeon where you get to team up with any maiden pair of your choice, slogging through mini-boss after mini-boss in pursuit of that creepy hand puppet. How dragged out? Well, the only note I took down about its structure is this last dungeon is taking forever. So, much longer than it needs to be. Eventually, you reach the end and confront Lack, who will now spell out their scheme for all to witness. The Maiden's ritual has been happening for hundreds of years, and both the people of the world and the spirits protecting the people would rather it just not happen anymore. I can sympathize with that. This all sounds a bit ridiculous. Luckily, Laddie seems to be the perfect vessel to act as their sanctuary, using her body as an eternal shelter. As you and the other maidens attempt to fight back, Lack transforms into a bizarre chimera of all the island's spirits, turning the final segment of the game into a pseudo-boss rush, where you team up with the different maidens to defeat their respective island spirits. And let me tell you, this segment actually kind of sucks. On paper, it's awesome, going against all the supernatural entities with the people meant to be their tributes, but each one is like the Wishiswin battle from the first game. A big damage sponge with heavy attacks that takes far too long to beat through for this sequence to be as good as it could be. This final stretch took me a whopping hour and 40 minutes, hammering away at them and necking Omnisalves, hoping I wouldn't get wiped out because I'd have to start all over again. Which did happen because the Ivory and Azure fight is baloney, and I hate it. Having to go through 3 fights like this before the final boss is absurd, and where the combat really just started getting old for me. After all of that, you get to fight Lack, who has 500 HP! Once they've been whittled down to their hand puppet form, Laddie agrees to become the spirit sanctuary. So I guess all that annoying boss crawl nonsense could have been avoided if they just asked nicely. Thanks, Laddie, I appreciate it. However, thanks to the battle that just occurred, Laddie's heart domain has been damaged, raising questions on how this is even supposed to work. I thought the heart was just affected by, emotional trauma, but apparently pseudo-physical harm works as well. This really is Kingdom Hearts. In order to fix it this time, Laddie must surrender 2 of her 3 precious memories she's gained over the course of the adventure. Only then will the damage be fixed and she can house all the spirits for eternity. And in a fun bit of narrative spice, you get to pick which ones she gives up. Now, if you'll remember, the ending of Isle Dragon Roars was determining the fate of the kingdom based on your use of the final dragon tier. But every choice you'd make ended in turmoil. The only way to get a really good ending was to gather all 10 mysterious cards. So you'd think there'd be some way for Laddie to keep all her memories, and you'd be wrong. There's no way to avoid this decision, and I love that. Admittedly, your choices here don't ultimately alter the ending, but I do appreciate the ability to change the context slightly. I like that. I chose to sacrifice family and love because removing the main character's bond here reminds me of Nier Ending D, and I like when a game gives me such an option. Hundreds of years later, a young boy who looks suspiciously like the protagonist wanders into the shrine and finds Laddie still preserved as the home for the guardian spirits, with the hero's sword laid next to her. A very satisfying conclusion, in my opinion. So that's Forsaken Maiden, a sequel which managed to change enough to be noticeable while keeping the same general experience. I'd say the improvements they made to story and combat are well done, but it still has a few kinks to work out in its formula. They made the plot more serious in tone, but I can see some people being turned off from that if you were hoping for a more comedic feel from IDR. The combat has some nice additions and difficulty adjustment, but some aspects are still a drag, like the overly high encounter rates and general pace of battle. Not necessarily 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but more like 2 steps to the side and half a step forward. It is improved, and I can definitely recommend it if you enjoy Isle Dragon, but the length in certain segments make it hard for me to say if it's truly better than the simplistic charm of the first game. Definitely good, just a bit different. Now, let's turn over that last card and see how it shakes things up. Okay, this is already longer than the Okage video, and I still have the 3rd game to cover. Beast of Burden is the final game for this video, released on September 13th, 2022, and it has the unique distinction of possessing a name where every time I read it, I think of the Rolling Stones.
I don't need a Beast of Burden.
Of all three entries, Beast of Burden is simultaneously the most ambitious and the most problematic, which in a way makes it the most Nier-like of the entire series. In more ways than just that, since the developers actually took inspiration from the narrative and aesthetics of Nier. The tone is darker, the color palette is muted and monochromatic, the world is even more oddly melancholic than Isle Dragon Roars, and it never quite feels like all its ideas are fully realized. If Isle Dragon Roars was a cozy fall evening and Forsaken Maiden was a bright summer vacation, Beast of Burden is a bleak, snow-covered winter night. Starting with the darker tone, the setup hits you like a medium-sized tuna to the left cheek. In this world, humans have been at war with monsters for years. Bit of a nitpick off the bat, the line that explains this specifically says they are creatures called monsters, which is insanely redundant seeing as people use those two terms interchangeably, and the only reason a story should use the term creatures called is when said creatures are called something unique to that lore. I know this is petty, but I already complained about the gem sound, so I can't look more pedantic. Anyway, this war became so deadly, humans have escaped underground, leaving the surface for the sake of survival. You play as a young girl working as a defender, whose name by default is I have no idea how you're supposed to say that, but I'm calling her Iris. I was going to call her Edge, but that doesn't really work, and now I have to give the most obvious giveaway as to what I'm referencing. Darn. Apparently Yoko Taro was tired of having male protagonists, so this game has a girl as the main character. The narrator is a woman too, Karen Gilfrey. I couldn't find any roles I recognized, but she's voiced a ton of NPCs and stuff for games. You live day to day gathering and distributing food for your fellow villagers. There's a sweet little kid, a nice old lady, a kindly neighbor boy, your loving mother, and then monsters invade and kill them all. Oh, and it was your 14th birthday, just to make things extra poignant. Just as a monster is about to kill you, you're saved by a mysterious boy, finally break to the surface, and then things happen. They just happen. You'd imagine an opening that strong would warrant a focused narrative, but it somehow ends up feeling even more picaresque than Forsaken Maiden. You talk about wanting revenge on the monsters, but then you're taken to a city and get rid of a separate monster for a group of councilmen, then the boy kills them for their terrible treatment of him, and you two go on the run. His name's Legol, by the way. The rest of the story is your party visiting different locations, staggering around without any major overarching task. You're even joined by 2 more party members, and they don't really add a solid goal to this whole thing. Polka, an overly verbose smarty pants who studies monsters in hopes of continuing his lost parents' research, and Trollis, a half-monster girl who works at a traveling carnival. There's no dragon to slay or island to save, and the whole revenge on monsters thing doesn't come back until the last segment of the game. Instead of a massive end goal that gives each situation some instance of progress, the story is more about social commentary. Many situations you stumble upon serve as very clear analogies to ones in the real world, with the most obvious example being a village living near a lake of flammable water. This resource is called Tinder Water, and while it can't help you find romantic partners on a somewhat questionable app, it is the foundation for the village's economy. As you explore the town, you come across a group of orphans whose parents have died to a mysterious disease, one that's also afflicted the mayor's child. At first they believe it's being caused by a poison emitted by the Flame Primal, a powerful monster living in the lake. Quick trip to the dungeon later, and it turns out the real cause of the illness is the Tinder Water itself. Life hack, don't drink anything that's flammable! When you tell the mayor about this, he insists they cannot stop using the Tinder Water to stop the spread of disease. Their way of life is tied to its use, so they can't just abandon it despite knowing all the risk. The comparison to our real world's over-reliance and stubborn adherence to non-renewable resources despite their detrimental effects isn't so much a subtle undercurrent as it is a neon sign covered in Christmas lights. It's just a shame how, in real life, they don't tell you about some super special hidden area of the world that will magically solve all their problems. You learn about a mythical location called New Terra. Real creative naming there, and the last third of the game is just about finding it. They say it's a fairy tale, no way it could be real, but of course that means it's absolutely, totally, 100% real. The rest of the locations you visit across your adventures kind of carried the same air. It's not really going from place to place in pursuit of a larger story. It's more like, okay, go here and learn about something, go here and learn about something, and then stuff happens, you're kicked back into the desert, and then you just go to the next thing that happens. I'm kind of split on this approach because while it does allow the game to explore more ideas and themes, it also causes the events to feel so lacking in impact. Nothing we do in one area is related to the next, which is the point of picaresque narrative, but it makes it feel unfulfilling since I have no real point to work towards. From scene to scene, there are darker, deeper undertones to analyze than in the previous two, like the Village of Light, which I don't want to discuss because go play the game. And there is one very heavy-handed sequence near the end to make the overall theme clearer, but it never feels like the story ends. It's like you're experiencing a sequence of progressively more significant events to showcase the world rather than go on one cohesive journey. That's not to say it's bad. If anything, I think it has the most engaging narrative of the series so far. But there are moments where I felt I was never making progress because you kind of aren't. Which, again, reminds me a lot of Nier. And that makes sense, seeing as Yoko Taro actually helped with the story this time due to time constraints. So overall, I do think the story is good, but in the sense of stewing in all these different concepts and messages and characters. The ending especially, so... Wait, I need to talk about combat. The gameplay actually has a few big differences from Forsaken Maiden, mainly due to it turning into a monster catching game. You know, like Yokai Watch. Instead of your party learning unique skills as they level up, you capture monsters within cards and assign them to characters to use in battle. This is explained in the story as the protagonist being a sub-Terran, which should really be subterranean, a person capable of subduing and controlling the monsters of the world. Doesn't really explain why your party members are able to use the cards too, but you know what, I won't question that aspect. Now, unlike other monster catching games like Yokai Watch or Shin Megami Tensei, you don't get them by weakening them in combat or negotiation. Instead, if you win a battle, there's a chance their card might appear in a chest you get as a reward. Pick a card, it might be the monster, and that's it. It's not particularly involved, and I really wish they'd give you some more tools to control the RNG. If they gave you, if there was a piece of equipment that was just like x-ray glasses and they let you see what cards there were, that would be amazing. That would be wonderful. For example, monster cards have different levels, and there's always a chance you can find a more powerful one than one you already have to make it stronger. However, this is entirely down to random luck. There were several moments where there were 2 monster cards in a chest of 3, and I got neither of them. There are pet shops where you can buy some you might have missed, but it doesn't get each one you failed to pull, and they only sell the lowest level versions. As someone who plays Yu-Gi-Oh, I can tell you for certain, that is insanely annoying. Your abilities in combat are entirely reliant on what cards you can collect, so basing it all around random chance makes it feel more tedious than engaging. If I have to be stuck with this method, it would be really nice to have some upgrade mechanics so I don't have to rely on hopefully getting a better monster from a chest. Much like the story, I'm of 2 minds on this. On one hand, it is an intriguing mechanic that shakes up the combat and gives you an extra degree of control over your party setup. If a monster isn't doing much with one character, swap it out for a separate ability and see how that arrangement works. I also love how this gives an even more analog feel to the gameplay, making it feel more like a deck building board game or trading card game, which works well with the overall atmosphere. I've actually talked to at least 3 people about these games who think it's always been a deck builder instead of an old school JRPG, but now they'd actually be kind of right. At the same time, it also reduces the individuality of established movesets. In the previous games, and even other JRPGs that rely on unique skill sets, the abilities of each party member bring across their personality along with a softly designated role in combat. Now, with every character able to use any skill, it causes them to feel interchangeable outside of their stats, which is a big shame since I think the main cast is the best one yet. Another change is how they made the passive option defend instead of charge from Forsaken. This is awful. This is just a dumb idea. When you play a turn-based JRPG, spending a turn on nothing but defense is rarely, if ever, a good option to have. You aren't doing anything but decreasing the damage you take, so you aren't helping your party or hurting the enemy, which is better than nothing at all like IDR, but it's so much worse than making a gem. It's such a useless ability that never came up. I didn't even need to defend until the final boss, and even that was just because it's mandatory or you'll lose instantly. I didn't even have a character die until then too, because this game is insanely easy. Heck, it's so easy I actually hit the inventory limit because I never needed to use the items, and the inventory is bigger than in the previous 2 games. That's kinda disappointing because of how Forsaken tried to amp up the challenge, but here we are again with nothing presenting a real threat. Maybe that's due to the monster cards being randomly obtained and they didn't want you failing because you didn't randomly pull the right ones? But that can't be it because the equipment is really cheap considering how much money you get and the enemy stats are pathetically low. Once again, it all comes back to numbers. Numbers that are too tiny to threaten your numbers, regardless of what monster cards you have. And to make it even worse, the gem sound is still the same. I don't really have much else to say about the combat, unfortunately. This is one of those things where, like, it's a cool idea, and I'm glad they tried it. It does have some nice spots, but overall, I'm feeling kind of lukewarm about it. The best thing I can say about the combat is how it's a fun concept, and the low difficulty means the story doesn't stall, so it's a pretty comfortable ride through a very uncomfortable world. Until you hit the last section of the game, and it all turns to baloney in a blender. I was considering not telling how the game ends because it actually has a pretty nice twist, but nah, this finale is so frustrating, I want to complain about it. So here's the last spoiler section. Skip here if you don't want to see the twist. This is the 3rd time in the video. Why did I talk about all 3 at once? Your journey takes you north to a giant wall of ice called the End Wall. Again, real creative naming there. Here's where the major motifs really start hitting you with an iron skillet. There's an elderly woman watching over a field of graves for those who tried scaling the wall and giving their lives in the process. She treats you like family, but passes on the next day. Your party discusses why death seems to follow them, like some kind of lingering curse. Your home village died, the senators died, those using Tinder water died, the village of light died, and now the only person to treat you all with kindness has died. Wanting to fulfill the dreams of her tribe, you fly up to an entrance in the end wall and fight your way to the top, reaching the land of fresh dirt. I mean New Terra. Told you it was real. There, you discover the scorched remains of a village featuring clues to the next location, the destination being a village of monsters. After donning monster forms of your own, you speak to them and realize they're just living normal lives, much like humans. They even have a pet shop. You enter the pet shop and see captured humans being treated like animals. Overcome with rage, you and the party set about killing each monster in the village. The card shown before battle even changes from an enemy appears to attacking a monster. It's very heavy-handed sequence that kind of shows up out of nowhere, seeing as no monster up to now showed any personality beyond, well, attacking people. The impact is also lessened since you have no choice in the matter. Kind of reminds me of the Undertale genocide run, but much less interesting since you have no agency in whether or not to kill everyone. All of this to bring across the point of humanity is the real monster. But it goes a bit deeper than that. Like literally. After you kill the creatures that invade your village, the mayor of the town gives you a key to his basement where the truth of the world will be revealed. One flight of stairs later, you find an area of desolated skyscrapers, rust-ridden cars, and... Wait a second. This is just Nier. Like really, this is just Nier, where the fantasy magic world is actually the post-apocalyptic future. I guess I could say it's also just Horizon, but I'd rather reference something well-written. The monsters are even wearing hoodies and headphones, and the skeletons are attacking with hockey sticks. It's kind of funny, honestly. As you wander through the ruins, finding mysterious devices like a digital camera and television, the monsters you find keep referring to someone or something called Mother. Once you reach the bottom of the ruins, you discover this mother is actually a human woman. Not only that, she's Polka's mother, whom he believed died from a monster attack when he was young. She's been taking control of the monsters this whole time due to her learning of their origins, which she shows you in a movie theater, which, you know, that's fun. And I gotta say, this explanation is certainly something. Okay, so roughly 1,000 years into this game's past, which is meant to be our real world's near future, ecological destruction and dwindling resources forced the world to war. During this time, a race of powerful bioweapons were created called aberrants, which is a term deserving of the preface creatures named, but I digress. However, they were too powerful and kept fighting even after the war ended, driving humanity to near extinction. In order to combat the aberrants, researchers took willing test subjects and mutated them into the first monsters. While these new defenders were able to defeat the aberrants, the rest of society began treating them with hostility and hatred, leading to the current state of the world. So, yeah, all the monsters you've been fighting this whole time, they're the descendants of willing humans who became mutated creatures to defend the rest of society. How Polka's mom figured this out, I'm not entirely sure, but now her goal is to use the same mutagen to transform the whole world into monsters so they stop treating the monsters terribly. Basically, her motivation is,
This world is imperfect.
What?
her name's Mizar, by the way. Which, fun fact, is the same name as the villain from Jet Force Gemini. That has literally nothing to do with this, I just thought it was interesting to mention. So how are you able to control the monsters then? I was hoping the explanation is, I have the Millennium Eye. But sadly that isn't the case. Nope, the Subterrans are the descendants of the research team who created monsters, and they developed some way to turn them into trading cards that also passed on genetically. If you thought the card thing was just shorthand for, like, a summoning animation, it isn't. You actually just turn them into cards. Maybe Kaiba was on the research team or something, I don't know. With all this revealed to the party, your final task is to stop Mizar from carrying out her evil scheme. You know it's evil because she could probably just tell this secret information to the people of the world instead of mutating them against their will, but villain's gonna villain. And you know, as much as I've critiqued this game so far, I have enjoyed the experience. The world is bleak and engrossing, the characters are endearing and go through some nice development, and the story is very intriguing to analyze. I was ready to call this my favorite game of the trilogy. And then I had to fight Mizar. This final boss fight is absolutely dreadful. I want to be introduced to whoever on the design team decided the marathon from the end of Forsaken Maiden wasn't aggravating enough, so they should make this one 10 times as frustrating because I've got something to introduce to them. A PowerPoint presentation that outlines why this final sequence is poorly designed. Starting off, you don't just have to fight Mizar, you have to go through 4 fights just to reach her. 2 against normal groups of monsters, then 1 where she summons humans to fight you just to hammer home the point even more, and 1 more against the 3 primals. After you waste time on all of those, she combines with the primals to form one insanely frustrating pile of baloney. Get this, she has 460 HP and 40 strength. And you can't even hit her until you deal with the Frost and Flame primals, which also have crazy high HP. They all deal out big party-wide attacks, reduce your stats, and just waste your time and resources until you kill them. Then once Mizar is by herself, she still casts stupidly powerful party-wide attacks while her attack is boosted and can dish out any status effect she wants. Not only that, but she also gives herself a buff that heals 20 HP every round, which doesn't sound like much, but when her main plan is raising her stats and reducing my whole party's, which is already having trouble dealing damage with her high stats, it trivializes any kind of progress you can hope to make. And for some reason, she can still use the Flame and Frost party hits when they're already dead. Like, no, that's just stupid. Just to reiterate, I never had a party member die on me or even use many items before this battle, and this final fight made me use every item in my inventory. And I still couldn't keep up. To make it even worse, I have to fight through 4 other battles to reach this point, and each attempt just getting here took me over an hour. After 3 tries, I had to go and do some level grinding, which was incredibly disheartening because these games hadn't had that problem until now. But of course, they didn't meet the cliche of obnoxious spike in difficulty at the end with the last 2 games, so I guess they just had to check that off the list. A good while later, I managed to raise everyone to level 25 and get some strong new monster cards through complete random chance, but I still nearly ran through all of my items because this boss is just, this is just like that. Once that finally ends, you're attacked by the guards from the first city. You're in a mythical land of prosperity and secrets of humanity's past. Just pay attention to that and leave me alone, you weirdly persistent knobheads. The goal pushes the rest of the party off the cliff to keep the mob busy as you escape. You find them later in monster form and are given a new objective: find the stars. Then it cuts to credits and dumps you at the title screen. What happened? What just happened? I mean, it was certainly interesting, more surprising than the twist from the first 2 games. It's just a shame that the final boss made this finale so much worse. Knowing Yoko Taro, this might be hinting at some bonus ending you get after going through a New Game Plus, but I'll be honest, I'm really tired of playing these games right now. I've yet to hear of any bonus ending online, but I might go through it just in case one exists. That's Beasts of Burden. It's very Nier-like. It's easily the most experimental of the trilogy in terms of both narrative and gameplay, and all the ideas they crammed in don't quite work out, but it's certainly fascinating. I appreciate the team wanting to change up the formula with the odd story structure and monster card system, but the end result is a bit of a mixed bag for me. Maybe that's due to playing and reviewing all these games in one go because I'm an idiot. I just felt so tired by the end. I don't dislike it. It has several aspects I enjoy, but I wouldn't recommend it in the same way I would with the other 2 games. Lovely, melancholic presentation on a big pile of unstable ideas and lofty goals, which again, is very much like Nier. And that's all 3 Voice of Cards games. Overall, they're good. Like, I knew from right off the bat these games wouldn't be amazing. They're lower budget titles developed by a smaller team, mainly experienced with mobile games. I was never under any belief they would be much more than fairly decent. And that's fine. More than anything, I think these are profoundly cozy games. The kind you marathon on a single cold day in late fall. It's your day off from work, so you bundle up on the couch in a fuzzy blanket, make a pot of hot cocoa, and just play it. That's what these games really feel like, and not really a sensation I get from many modern titles. For me, they do a better job capturing the feel of the old school JRPGs that inspired it than Octopath Traveler, which has served as the poster child for this retro wave Square's been having. Octopath was my reason for buying a Switch. I bought the collector's edition day one because it seemed like the kind of experience I've been wanting. I played it for a while, and just stopped after a few chapters. I'd pick it up every few months until I finally beat it last year. After a while, I figured out why I could never really stick with it. In terms of presentation, with the lovely HD 2D graphics and amazing soundtrack, it works well. It sells the idea of being a great homage to those old games, and the gameplay has a solid combat system coupled with an admittedly amazing job system. But after digging a bit more, that was all it really had. The stories are dull and overdone, the characters are basically non-existent, and the world just doesn't feel alive. It looks and feels like those retro titles, but it doesn't carry the same kind of soul. Man, I am so pretentious. For me, Octopath feels like it's sticking too close to the letter of old JRPGs rather than the spirit. They have the reputation of being long and grindy and having boring stories, so they made a long and grindy game with boring stories. When really, these games were built on exploring worlds, learning about characters, and going on fun journeys while exploring ideas and themes like any other good story. That's what Voice of Cards gives me, the experience I want from games like all the old JRPGs I collect. It's what I wanted, it's what I received, and that's enough for me to say I had a good time with it. They do have their issues and are, at best, just really polished RPG Maker games, but I'd recommend any one of them to someone who enjoys the retro titles that inspire them. If you'd like a more specific recommendation, Isle Dragon Roars is the most stripped down but classically satisfying. Forsaken Maiden is the most ambitious and grand, but goes on just a bit too long for my liking. And Beast of Burden is the most experimental, but drops the ball in a few aspects. So just pick up whichever one sounds nice to you, make that hot cocoa, and try them out. I hope we see more games in this series once Salim has had a break. And they changed that darn gem sound effect.